So today we're talking about the topic of respectful redundancies. And the reason we've chosen this topic has come from a couple of different fronts. We held a lunch and learn a month ago on probationary periods, and we put it out to the group there, some of the challenges that they were experiencing. And redundancies just keeps popping up. And people would really appreciate at the moment, given AI, there's a lot of change occurring in workplaces. And we thought, yep, it's probably a good idea to really hone in on redundancies. And ideally, what we want to talk about is how do we do them in a really respectful way that also is getting the outcome for the organisation and the commercial outcomes, along with delivering, what can be a really, really difficult and challenging conversation for everyone involved in the most respectful and human way possible, but also covering off all the legal risk. And we've got Sean Melbourne here. He's an absolute amazing employment lawyer. And we'd encourage you, as Paul said, to ask us any question you like. We'd love for you to find a really tricky one for us, because we love this topic and getting, going down the rabbit hole with any questions you've got. And also Celine will be giving lots of background from her experience as well as a HR consultant. And we're coming at it from, like, Celine and I are not employment lawyers, but we're HR consultants who have held conversations with people on redundancies hundreds of times. We've sat in the room. I know there's HR professionals on the chat here that have done it firsthand as well. And it is a very difficult conversation to have. You're basically changing someone's course of life, and it's all about doing it in the right way. And hopefully we can definitely get to the bottom of that. And we definitely encourage you to ask questions as we go. We have got the PowerPoint slides prepped up, and for us, we found the last session was really enjoyable because it was so engaging. People were asking us questions in the moment, and this being a live event as well, it makes it better when it's live and interactive. So definitely don't hold back and put your questions in there. Is there anything I've missed before we jump across?
No, I think just from my perspective, supporting many different businesses, there's just still so many gaps that businesses and key decision makers just don't know when it comes to this process. And it can feel quite mundane, and it can feel really complex. And we've spent a lot of time the last couple of years, especially just making it as streamlined as possible for businesses. And we'll go through what that process can look like before consultation even begins. But yeah, another purpose of today is just to streamline it as best as possible for everybody and just give you a bit of intel on what we feel is really complex for some businesses and where those gaps still lie, and hopefully you can take something away from that as well.
Beautiful. And we're coming to you from sunny Melbourne. You can see the rain bucketing down outside. And Sean, just to confuse everyone, Sean Melbourne is actually based in Sydney, just a bit more confusing. But we're definitely coming from Melbourne, and this is all very live. So feel free to interact and ask questions. So what I might do is share our first slide, if I can get all this working as it should.
Great.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Over to you, Sean.
All righty. Thanks, guys. So I'm going to talk to the legal aspects of redundancies today. I just want to keep in mind that we're doing that within the theme of respectful redundancies. So I don't think I'll talk to sort of where the legal edges are in the process, but that's not because I want you to just do a process that just follows a legal requirement. It's more so you know where the legal edges are, and you can make sure that you run the process in a way that minimises legal risk. But you should always layer over that how doing it in a way that's respectful to the people involved, because that's always going to produce the best result for everybody if you take that approach. So I guess firstly, just the basics of what is a redundancy. So the definition of a redundancy is it's when a business no longer needs the job to be done by anybody because of operational changes to the business. So you can distinguish that with a performance-based termination or a misconduct-based termination. Redundancies for business reasons, and it's about the role no longer being required rather than the person themselves. So it's very much focused on structural issues in the business. Now, a little fun fact about the Fair Work Act for those employment law nerds out there. So there's only there's two main places in the Fair Work Act that talk about redundancies. So one is the entitlement section where it talks about redundancy pay. And then the second place redundancies come in is in the unfair dismissal provisions in the Act. So there's no actual provisions in the Fair Work Act that say specifically deal with redundancies in their own right, but it comes into the Fair Work Act because a genuine redundancy is an exception to unfair dismissal. So the provisions say that you can't a dismissal won't be unfair if it's a genuine redundancy. And to be a genuine redundancy, there's three things that have to be present. So firstly is that it's actually a genuine redundancy, so that it is really that the person's role is no longer required in the business. The second one is that if the employee is covered by an award or enterprise agreement, the consultation provisions in that award or enterprise agreement have been followed. And the third one is that there's no reasonable possibility of redeploying that person into another role. So if those three boxes are ticked, I guess you could think of it that way. So it's a genuine redundancy, any consultation obligations have been complied with, and redeployment, there's no reasonable possibility of redeploying that person in the business, then that person won't be able to bring an unfair dismissal claim. So that's the kind of legal structure that applies in redundancies. So when I think about redundancies, that's how I think about them. We think about making sure all those three are covered off. In each of those three things, there's quite a lot of case law and intricacies that have sort of give us guidance on what to follow, but they're the three main legal things that you'd want to have in mind as you go through a redundancy process. So I guess I'll pause there. Do you guys have any sort of thoughts about that or questions about that?
Yeah, but have we got any questions so far from the group?
Yes. So what we got is from Lauren. What's considered to be the minimal consultation period for a redundancy of a non-award period?
Great question.
Very good question. Did that say for a non-award employee? Is that what it says?
For a non-award period.
Okay. Very, very good question. So I guess firstly, if it's a non-award employee, so there's no award or enterprise agreement that covers that person, there will be no obligation to consult with them. Now that comes as a surprise sometimes because sometimes people think there's always an obligation to consult. The obligation to consult only applies if there's award or EA consultation requirements. So if they're award free, there will be no obligation. So that means there's also no specific time period when it comes to consult with them. So it's really up to you then to design a process that is respectful and a time period that gives them enough opportunity to consider and get their feedback and their input. If someone is award covered, then there's also a question about, well, what's a good time period? Because even in the award consultation provisions, there's actually no time period specified as to how long the consultation process has to go for. But I think there's a few things that you need to consider and take into account when you determine the length of the process. So firstly, you have to give that person enough time to, once they find out about what's happening, you've got to give them enough time to consider it and give their input into the process. So if you give them like an hour to consider it, that's probably not going to be genuine consultation, because the whole idea of the process is that you're getting that person's input before a final decision's made. So it might be, and each process is different, but it might be that you have an initial meeting, you give the person all the information about the redundancy, and then you give them a day or 2 days to consider it, and then come back to you and have another meeting where you just give them an opportunity to provide their input. That's just a rough sort of example. And then the other thing that you need to make sure of is that once they've given their input, there's been enough time for you to consider their input before making a final decision. So if you get their input and then 5 minutes later you terminate their employment, you obviously haven't really consulted with them because you probably had the decision already made. But you need to make sure once you receive their input, you actually do take some time to consider it before coming to a final decision.
Yep. The other part, that's great, Sean. The other assumption that's built into that is that you know that they are award free or which award they're covered by. So what we find is that people can assume that a particular role is covered by a particular award, but we know that there's been examples of that in even large corporates where they've mucked that up, and there's been confusion about what is the correct award, and then what is the correct way to deal with it. So the assumption in everything we're saying here is you've really got to be clear and know that they are award free.
Yeah.
And often people are not 100% confident
Yeah.
in that. So it's being careful. If you are going to do that, just be really careful that you know you are on solid ground.
It's a really good point because often there
Sorry,
is
go,
an
Sean.
award lurking around that nobody knows about, or they might think that they're in a senior position, so they're not award covered, but there are awards that catch some senior people, and sometimes people just haven't done a proper award assessment, so they just sort of assume the person's award free, but then they might then get a letter from their lawyer saying that they're covered by an award and you haven't followed consultation obligations.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and I think even from my perspective, even if you can be really certain and you've worked closely with a HR representative for your organization and you're pretty certain that you are the person's award free, I think the right thing is still to consult and do it in the best way possible, which is why we're sitting here talking about respectful redundancies, because it's a huge implication on someone's individual circumstances and these changes. So by dotting your I's and crossing these T's and just doing the consultation anyway, I think is going to save you so much potential risk that could come from it. And it's genuinely just the right thing to do as well. You don't want to cut corners. If you put yourself in their shoes as well, how would you expect the process to be handled in the best possible way for the individual and especially for the business and the reputation of the business as well?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Any other questions on that particular slide? Otherwise, we can jump to the next one.
There are a few. So let's talk about Jessica's question. In regards to consultation, by nature, the company has already decided to make the role redundant in taking this step. So is there really a chance for their input to change the outcome?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. And having sat in the meetings where we go through the consultation process, well, I'll tell you what we shouldn't do is have a predetermined outcome. So when businesses have already made, okay, we've made this decision, and we know we're just going through the process, it's actually slowing it down enough to hear people's views about potential redeployment. What other things haven't we considered? That is a real step that people miss, and the decision's kind of been made, and we're just going to skim through it and go through the redundancy process without actually stepping through the consultation steps
Also,
really
just the
clearly.
circumstances of the business before even jumping to what the decision may be and how it can affect roles, but what are the circumstances of the business and why are we sitting here today, which can sometimes be skimmed through, which is why it's important for key decision makers and business owners to sit down and do the homework in the background and develop a business case to understand, okay, what are the reasons why we're sitting here today, considering whether some or one role within the business is potentially no longer required, and if you are fulfilling consultation and going through with this process with individuals that are involved, helping them understand the business circumstances as to why you're sitting there, I think is a huge aspect of the genuine redundancy and being respectful about it.
Yeah.
What about yourself, Sean? What would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it is very common for a business to have already made a decision when they're moving to redundancies. Not all the time, but it's not, it does happen. And sometimes that's just because, say might be a smaller business and they already know they need to let a certain role go. So it's sort of a natural thing. But I mean, from a legal perspective, if there are consultation obligations, you need to make sure you follow them, because if you don't, it'll open the door to an unfair dismissal claim. Um, so it is important that you do go through the process, but I think it's just looking at it from that human perspective. You know, that this is a process. Even if there's a decision made, you still need, before finalising that decision, you need to, take care of the employee and take steps to help them understand the situation and what it means for them. And like Steve said, talk to them about redeployment and whether there's any possibility of redeployment, because that's often a big part of the consultation. Like, even if a role has already, the sort of decision's already been made, the next thing really is to have a good discussion about redeployment and whether that's possible.
Yeah. And I've had that happen in my experience, where you go through the consultation process, and someone goes away, thinks about it, comes back with an idea. Yeah, wow, we didn't think of that. There's another idea that we haven't considered, and I've seen that actually happen. So it's not just a tick the box from a fair work point of view, but there are times, like, it's probably the rarity, to be honest. Like, it's more probably the rarity that does happen. But there's definitely been times in my experience where people have come back, thought about it, and go, look, what if we cut the role up in a certain way? If I worked part time or whatever. That's definitely happened as well. So there is that, and Fair Work have built that in there. So we do consider the redeployment or the consultation element. So we're hearing the employee's perspective on how else it could be structured. So that's a great question. Have we got any others? Any other questions on this one?
We do. So I am going to just call it and end this poll here.
Yeah.
So the results, I'm not sure if it's visible on your end, but nearly 40% of you said that in regards to redundancies, what do you feel least confident about? It's about communicating the decision respectfully to others, which is understandable.
Well, there you go. Well, we're in the right zone then. Because this is the whole purpose of today, is how do we get the decision, so the decision's been made, or the decision's being made during the process, and then how do we deliver it respectfully? And that's a really interesting one. And ultimately, there's the implications at Fair Work. So when it's done, if we go the opposite, if it's done disrespectfully, and that's a great way to get an unfair dismissal case. But it's also to get, just as a human being, it's not a great way to live in the world, but it's also getting reputational brand damage to the business, because people find lots of creative ways on social media to come back at businesses. People can be pretty creative in how they express their grumpiness in a process, and being respectful. And as Celine said, you put yourself in their shoes. Like, how would I feel if I was on the other side of the table? How would I like to be spoken to? I want to be told the truth, but I also want to be heard. I want to have my perspective taken seriously. I want to make sure my entitlements are paid out. All those things. What would you add, Sean, from a legal context? Or you're not just a lawyer, but you're also a pretty great human being as well. So you can combine both, I'm sure.
I mean, I think, I just think it's good to be respectful to people for any reason, but definitely the biggest driver of unfair dismissal claims is when someone has been disrespected in a process and they feel disrespected. It's not usually the legal aspects that drive an unfair dismissal claim. It's someone feeling offended or like they haven't been treated well. And that comes from feeling like they've been disrespected. So that on its own is a great legal protection. But also, I think people just really appreciate openness and honesty. The more open and honest you can be about what's happening, the reasons for it happening, include them as much as you can in the process. People appreciate that. No one really likes just being told their employment's been terminated and they don't really get the real story, or they feel like they're sort of being given half truths or something like that. So I just think genuineness, openness, honesty is the key to make these processes go well.
Absolutely. So it's interesting that was the number one element of it. And at the end of the day, lawyers are in the background. No respect to you, Sean, because you're one of the good guys in terms of the lawyers. I'm sure there's other good lawyers out there, but Sean's definitely in. But it's often the HR person who's delivering the news, and it's the psychology that goes into it. It's also we're considering the legal impact, but there's also the grieving process and slowing it down so people can psychologically catch up with the reality. Like they could be called into a meeting, and then all of a sudden they're sitting there with a person from HR and their boss, and their adrenaline just goes off, and they're then in fight flight mode. They're not actually listening to anything you're saying at that point. They're not absorbing it. You've got to give them time to go away and process it. And that's one thing that the Fair Work Act does really well, which is the consultation stuff slows it down enough so the person can go away, reflect, think about it, and come back. And often we just can just dump a whole lot of information at someone who's not really in a place to then absorb it. And then the decision's been made, and then they're going home to their family and saying, well, this has happened, but they go, why? And they just don't remember anything.
I
They
think
don't
even
absorb
from
it.
my perspective as well, it's just ensuring that you're preparing to deliver the information as best as you possibly can. So when I've held consultation meetings really closely with key decision makers, it's obvious when they do their homework when they're consulting with the employees because they're going through the detail in as much respectful and honest detail as possible to help them understand the circumstances. But it's about preparing on how you're going to be communicating such complex and pretty crappy news to somebody.
Mm.
And if you're not thinking about that and preparing it beforehand, it's certainly shown. And then that's when that human element can be cut off and it may not be received as a respectful, I guess, context of why we're here today. And, ultimately we can never control how someone's ever going to receive information. But as long as we can walk into conversations and prepare and feel confident that we've walked away from it and gone, okay, I know that I've delivered that in the best possible way. Ultimately, they're going to be emotional. They'll take that away and need some time to process. But I think that's your duty of care is just preparing for that communication as best as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed. Totally agree. All right, should we do the next slide?
So, firstly, genuine redundancy. So let's just talk to that for a minute. So there's often, I guess, sometimes redundancies get used as a replacement for performance management. Like someone sees it as a way of letting someone go without having to go through a performance management. And it is true that it's safer to terminate someone if you've got a genuine redundancy. It's harder to bring a claim. But if the real reason is performance, it won't be a genuine redundancy. So you really do need to have proper business reasons for it to be a genuine redundancy, and that'll get found out in some point in the process. So, yeah, have you guys seen any of that?
All the time.
All the time, yeah.
The word's probably avoidance, isn't it? So it's rather than dealing with the performance. And often we say early on we'll get the phone call and it'll be pick one path. If it's a performance issue and it's really a performance issue, don't avoid it. Don't avoid it. Deal with the performance issue. So for example, if the person's on a second warning and now we want to make them redundant, well, that's just muddied the waters because are they really being
Yeah.
is the position really being made redundant? And if you forget everything about this whole talk about redundancies, keep this one thing in mind, which is the redundancy is about the role. It's about the role, not the person. So
Yeah.
it's about me sitting in this chair. I can sit in this chair. Someone else can come and sit in this chair, but it's making the chair redundant. But it's kind of disconnecting the human from the role is probably the key. And what happens in our experience, there's a lot of muddying of the waters around the human and their behavior or their performance that then flows into redundancy. And I'm sure you get that because it ends up with lawyers involved if it's done incorrectly.
Yeah. Sometimes it can go the other way too. Like someone's doing a performance process and then there is a genuine redundancies that come through the organization, and so you might need to make someone redundant who's on a PIP, for instance. So that would still be a genuine redundancy, but I would say to be a bit more careful about it, because there's the potential for that person to say, well, this isn't genuine because you were doing performance management. You just need to make sure there is a genuine business case for the redundancy, and if there's other people in the organisation being made redundant, that's helpful as well.
And I would get a lawyer. I would get a lawyer involved if that was a client with that scenario. I'd say you better call Sean. Like, you better get a lawyer involved, because it's messy. Like, it could, you could still get the outcome, but
get your story straight.
It's messy.
Yeah.
That in complexity.
Yeah.
And the other thing this is kind of related, but sometimes people target specific employees because they just don't like them, or they want to exit them from the business for some reason. And that's also not going to be a genuine redundancy, because again, you're targeting the person rather than the chair, to use Steve's great analogy there. So that doesn't, it might seem like a good idea, but it doesn't usually end well, because people can tell when that's happened.
Yeah, which then comes back to the question, if you've got, for example, you've got 10 people in a particular team, and one of those people are being made redundant, and the person in the meeting says, well, why me? Why me? That is a tricky answer. And that's where things like adverse action comes in. And Sean and I were actually talking, Celine and I were talking about running a lunch and learn on adverse action. The problem is no one asks us about it because nobody knows about it. And we'd worry that nobody would turn up. But it's the thing to think about. It's probably it's scarier than unfair dismissal in terms of your employment law risks. And the why me is an adverse action risk that businesses just don't consider. And sure, maybe it's worth giving people a bit of context around adverse action, because I feel like it's one of those topics where it's just unknown.
Yeah. So I guess adverse action is really if it comes down to the reason for the decision to terminate. So if part of the reason is an unlawful reason, so an unlawful reason could be terminating someone because they exercised a workplace right, such as maybe they went on sick leave and people didn't like them being on sick leave and they had their employment terminated. Or it could be a discriminatory reason, like because of their gender or carers' responsibilities or their racial background, something like that. So they're all unlawful reasons to terminate someone's employment. And if you do terminate someone's employment because of any of those reasons, or if they factor into the decision, then someone can bring an adverse action claim. The key to avoiding that is to make sure you have very good business-related reasons for a termination. So that's why it's important to document the reasons for going through redundancies. So I think, Steve, you shared a really good example of the two org charts side by side of how you do that.
Yeah, so what we do, we go back to what is the business case. So people want to know the why, like why is this occurring? And some of the things we coach businesses to do is to do current state org chart. So this is the structure, is that as it is now, and a future state org chart is this, and these are the business reasons or the organisation reasons why this role isn't required. So you're doing current state, future state, and it makes it really clear for the person to see what the operational changes are. The other one is around the external changes. So there might have been a large client that's been lost, or there's been a downturn in sales, and having some data, like high-level data on the why.
Yeah.
And that will make the conversation much smoother, because people will go from going, oh, this is about me, taking it personally, to going, look, this is just a business decision that we've made, a hard decision. And the words, like it's coming back to me, having unfortunately sat in these meetings a lot, we're making a hard decision that's in the best interest of the business that you may not agree with. but this is the why. And why we're making this decision is we need to make sure the business is sustainable in the long term. And it's getting that really, really clear to the person. Because again, you think about it from a psychological point of view, they're in fight, flight mode. They're not absorbing a whole lot of information at the moment. They're thinking about them, what am I going to do? What am I going to do next? And it's giving them really like factual, truthful information that would then, and the key to it, which is I also say to business, would this stand up in Fair Work? So would this reason, if you had to justify it as a reason, would it stand up at Fair Work as a logical reason as well?
Yeah, and I've seen a really good document you've got, Celine, as a business case sort of template where you sort of map out the different business-related reasons for the redundancy, including like redeployment and everything.
Yeah.
That's a really good thing to have in place because, firstly, I think it sort of forces you to go through the thinking yourself first before you even start the process. But then you'll have a documented reason that justifies it being a redundancy. So if there ever is something like an adverse action claim or something, you can come back to that document and say, well, here are all the reasons for why we made the decision.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something that we've worked on really closely. Our team over the last 12 months is just systemizing this as best as possible, which I spoke to at the start of the meeting. And we want to make sure that, like I said before, businesses or key decision makers are doing their homework. And it might seem like a bit of a mundane process at the very beginning, but I've even had clients provide some feedback at the very end once consultation is finished and when roles have been made redundant. And they've actually noted that it's helped them feel confident as a key decision maker for a business that if the person were to apply for an unfair dismissal claim, that they could stand there confidently and confirm that they've taken all the appropriate steps. And yes, it is absolutely genuine because of this checklist and because of this business case that we've constructed. And to support that business case, there's a management checklist as well. And this is a lot of, I guess, background documentation that we would work closely with the key decision makers on. It's not really necessarily something that you would provide to the employees that you're consulting with, but it helps prepare for those consultation discussions around the why and being respectful. And then it's just as simple as following that checklist and ensuring that you're ticking all those boxes, because as much as this is a human element and how personal it can feel for some people, we want to depersonalize it and ensure that we are ticking the boxes the whole time and not missing anything as well.
A lot of it's planning, isn't it?
Yeah,
really good planning with the right people in the process, and then it just runs so much smoother.
It does.
If we get involved when it goes wrong, it's often hard to unscramble it. But when there's a really good planning process at the beginning, and we get all this stuff in order, have the letters prepared, have the process clear, have know what the consultation elements are under the award, or even understand the employment contracts. Make sure there's nothing that's going to jump out at us in an employment contract. Having all the planning done is so important. I can't emphasize that enough. And that just makes the whole thing smoother, and also gives you the confidence when you're in the room, because you're dealing with a whole lot of emotion and people's reactivity, which is only to be expected.
And from a consulting perspective, it helps me walk into these circumstances and processes feeling confident, because I'm ensuring that those key decision makers are taking the right steps. And being involved in this consultation is obviously never easy, regardless of what chair you're sitting in. Right. But it helps me feel confident within my role to know that all the appropriate steps have been taken. And that's important from our perspective as well, because we don't want to be thrown in the deep end, but as well, we want to ensure that everyone is set up for success, regardless of whether you're an employee affected or a key decision maker that has to be fulfilling the process as well. So.
Yeah, and we're in a fortunate position as consultants. We will walk away from a situation if we're not confident. If a client asks us to do something in a certain way, we don't agree, that doesn't align with our values as a business, we will say we're not the people for you, and we align ourselves to the way that we do it, because we know it works. No, we know it works from a human way, but it also mitigates employment law risk as well. Yeah. And we don't want to be involved in processes that aren't right. So just at a really simple level. So we had more slides. Have we got questions coming in, Paul, that we need to jump to, or should I add to the next slide?
Look, there are some questions here. Some of them are actually quite detailed. I'm just going to
Sure.
do some really, let's start with the basic one here. So for businesses that are 15 staff and under, what are the responsibilities for small businesses in regards to redundancies?
Yeah,
Very
well,
good question.
yeah. Fire away,
So,
Sean. Yeah.
yeah, so small businesses have the same obligations with respect to redundancies in terms of the process and it needing to be a genuine dismissal. You can take advantage of the small business fair dismissal code, but that sort of has a similar process in it. The main difference for small businesses, so if you've got less than 15 employees, is there's no obligation to make redundancy pay under the Fair Work Act. So you probably know there's a scale of redundancy pay required. Some goes from sort of 4 weeks down to, and it's a scale based on length of service. That won't apply to a small business. But one thing I would say is just remember that the when you're counting the numbers of employees, you need to take into account employees of related companies. So if you've got other companies in your group or something like that, those employees count as well. So sometimes that can push you over the 15 employee mark.
Yeah. And that one does catch people out, particularly, and it's going back to payroll and seeing how many people are actually on payroll. Particularly in a smaller business, they might have family members or whatever on payroll, and they go, oh, but we've only got 12
Mm.
people, but actually you might have 15. And if you're close to 15, it can also tip you in to being heard as a large employer. And it is a distinction that Fair Work applies. So you're a small business, when you're less than 15, but once you're over 15, you are treated like a large corporate employer, and you need to get it right. There's no other way around it. And if you're at the edge of it, I would say just almost treat it like you're a large employer anyway, because sometimes it can be heard at
Mm.
Fair Work. So yeah, any other
Yeah.
but that's a great question. Any other questions, Paul?
Yeah. So one question, this is like two in one, but let's start with the first part. When should the consultation begin? So when the role is identified as possibly being
Yeah.
redundant, or when the business is first aware a change needs to be made, but no action is confirmed yet, i.e., board wants cost savings or operational
Yeah.
changes.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting one. I know I've had conversations. So in enterprise agreements, there's specific consultation obligations around when decisions are made. I remember being in a conversation with a union, and I said, well, if you wake up in the middle of the night and think of something, is a decision made at that point? So you've got to be basically, once the decision making process has been worked through, it really depends on how that's articulated within. It could be the enterprise agreement, it could be in the consultation requirements under the award, and Sean, I know you can add a lot to this, but it does become a nuanced conversation of when you make a decision and then when does that get communicated.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a really, really great question.
I can tell you the actual what it says in the awards about timing. So um, if an employer makes a definite decision to make major changes in production, program, organization, structure, technology that are likely to have a significant effect on employees, the employer must start the consultation process. And it says you got to commence discussions as soon as practicable after a definite decision has been made. So
So
yeah, so
that's where the debate comes in. When was the decision made? But I think a lot of it's consistency, and it's communicating the message. Because if the business is like going through, like, lost a major client, and that's public information, then it's communicating it, talking to people about it. It's not surprising people. So it's people going, well, I thought we are doing really well. Like, why are there redundancies? It doesn't make sense. When it's not logical and not rational as to why, people will sort of will get agitated with it. And that definition is great, but there's so much interpretation and grey in that. And
Yeah.
people can have their own perspective on that, which I've experienced. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great question, though.
What was the second part to that question, Paul?
Sorry, your audio's off, Paul.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, apologies, wrong button. How would the high income threshold come into play here?
Yeah.
Well, I guess the high income threshold could play a part in that it can determine whether someone can bring an unfair dismissal claim or not. So if someone is not covered by an award or enterprise agreement and they earn above the high income threshold, they won't be able to bring an unfair dismissal claim. So that means none of those three requirements matter. So the genuineness, the consultation, or the redeployment, from a legal perspective, they won't impact whether they can bring an unfair dismissal claim. Whereas if they're under the threshold, then they can bring an unfair dismissal claim, and so you have to meet those three requirements to avoid an unfair dismissal claim.
Yeah. Right.
Great question.
Any other questions?
Maybe let's do this one and then we can continue on. So this is from Ethan, and it's a question for Sean. How does developing the scope of psychosocial hazards affect the consultation requirements for award-free employees?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. And that's an area that's becoming more and more relevant and attention paid to it. So the psychosocial safety obligations apply to all employees at all times. So whether there are consultation obligations or there are not consultation obligations, you'll have obligations to take care of someone's psychological well-being as you go through this process. So what that means is that you need to ensure the process is done in a way. It's not so much about following the consultation processes, but it's making sure the employee's well-being is taken care of. So, and that basically comes back to all the things we've talked about. So being open, honest, making sure you're taking care of them, you consult with them, all those play into meeting the psychosocial obligations. And interestingly, I don't know if you saw this last year, but the New South Wales regulator intervened in a redundancy process UTS was going through because they considered that they weren't doing sufficient consultation with the employees. So they actually issued a notice stopping the process until they were back in compliance. So that was sort of the first time we'd ever seen that sort of intervention. So, but that's now a possibility, especially for larger businesses that are that are sort of being monitored more closely with these issues.
Yeah. And just to add to that, the other things that are quite supportive is giving people outplacement support. So what are they going to do? So as part of the redundancy process is offering them support to help them find another job. And we do that as part of our service. There's also connections to EAP if they have an EAP service. But it all adds to the psychosocial responsibilities. And again, as Sean said, it's about doing it respectfully and as humanly as possible to get all those things covered. But it's definitely a great question. And I have got a slide at the end that I'll share about a session that our partner business, which is Risk Strategies, they're running a lunch and learn specifically on psychosocial safety. So I'll share that at the end. There's a QR code, so you can have a look at that as well.
Yeah, I did see that Ethan raised his hand. So did you still want to ask a question on the microphone, Ethan?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, do you think it's plausible now, Sean, to be doing risk assessments pre-decision before you walk into these redundancies, particularly in Victoria, so you can monitor psychosocial hazards and have that assessment ready if you ever are forced to bring that forth by a regulator?
Yeah, I think it's a very good idea because I mean, especially for larger businesses that'll have the attention of regulators because, I mean, that was where UTS got caught up is they didn't have that in place. So yeah, that's what a regulator will look for if they've got concerns about the process. So yeah, definitely great to incorporate that in. I mean, I'd say that's more for larger size businesses in particular, because especially if you're doing mass redundancies. But yeah, it's a really good point.
Thanks.
Beautiful. All right, we'll go to our last.
Let me just make sure that Sean has covered all those points there on that slide that we had up before. Yep.
We'll go to that.
Is there anything else, Sean, that you wanted to cover off on those slides before we move on?
The only other thing I guess would just redeployment. I mean, that's an area where that can be, challenging. So a couple of things I'd say about redeployment is you've got to make sure you don't make assumptions about what another role that a person might take or not. Because there have been cases where people have it's been found that an employee should have offered roles like in another city or things like that. There was even one where the employee should have been offered a potential role in India. And the point that's been made in these cases is that the employer shouldn't assume that an employee won't want to take on it. They won't want to move city or something like that. They have to offer those roles, as part of that process. And the other thing I'd say that gets misunderstood sometimes is it's a sort of a positive obligation on the employer to redeploy someone if it's reasonable to do so. So you can't just kind of say to an employee, "Oh, you just apply for any open roles and see how you go." You got to actually make proactive steps to redeploy them into a role because you need to satisfy your obligations under the Fair Work Act. If you dismiss and you can't show that there's no reasonable opportunity to redeploy them, then they can bring an unfair dismissal claim.
Yeah. And then you're looking at the position description of that role and do they fit the skills and qualifications of that particular role as well. They might not be suitable. So for example, it might be a vacancy for an accountant and they could be in sales and you go, well, you're not actually skilled for that role. It doesn't make logical sense. So it's got to be, the right role for the right person. But that's part of the consultation obligations is for them to also give ideas that we haven't considered as well. Beautiful. Should we move to the next slide?
Sounds good.
You happy to move to the next one, Sean?
Yep.
We've covered a lot of this.
Yeah, I was going to say we've already covered a lot of this. So I guess, yeah, just at a really simple level, as we've noted already, we've systemized the consultation and best practice process as best as we possibly can. Obviously, we'll continue to be evaluated and reviewed and improved. But the first step is really just completing a business case. So if I just give a hypothetical example, a business comes to us that we support with their HR and they say, hey, look, we feel as though this role or these roles may be made redundant. I always go back to, okay, why is that the case? And talk them through that. And then I actually get them to fill out this business case document, which is something it's homework that they would do in the background that could be presented if up against Fair Work. But it's answering a series of questions. I think it's about 10 or 12 questions regarding the why behind it. So what implications have happened to the business to help them come to this decision? What roles does it involve? When would they expect to make these changes and why? Does it involve more than one person that's fulfilling the same shoes of the role? So if you've got one person that's employed under the same role within the business, and how many people does that actually involve? And then following through with those most appropriate steps. And then once they've completed that business case document, that's when I sit down with them and really ensure that the decision is genuine and that we're setting that process up for success before we even start to organise these consultation meetings. And then that's when a checklist comes in really, really handy, which is what we've got there in step 3. So best practice checklist. And it's just confirming all those areas that we need to ensure that we're preparing for the delivery. But then also when it comes to consultation, what are those steps that we need to take when we're consulting behind the scenes, but then also with the person, time frame obligations, what we need to consider for them, redeployment, And then obviously there's a follow-up meeting, which would be the outcome meeting, as long as there's been a genuine amount of time between first consultation to follow-up of considering any redeployment, considering their responses, any ideas that we haven't taken into consideration, and then having that outcome meeting if the role or roles are going to be made redundant. And then what outplacement support, as Steve noted before, is going to be supporting the person to be able to move along. And that really does help in terms of the outplacement support from our perspective. But then the key areas of, okay, what are their entitlements? What is their notice period within their employment contracts that we need to follow? Are we a large business or small, which is all part of the preparation and business case? What does that payout look like for the individual that might be impacted? And ensuring that you're following that checklist there. So,
Cool.
yeah, I think that covers everything. Sean, is there anything else you'd... Oh, sorry, Steve, maybe you want to go first?
Yeah, what I was going to do is jump through that. We've got 2 slides left, and then we can just turn the slides off and then just go through any questions that people have got. So let me just skip through. Thanks for that, Celine.
That's okay.
So this is the Lunch and Learn coming up on the 2nd of June. This is run by Deb. Deb's amazing at this. And it'll be going into psychological safety in depth. And again, it's interactive and you can chat. There is a QR code that you can jump on to connect into that. And I highly recommend jumping along to that. The other thing I thought I'd mention as well is our free HR health check. This is an online tool that we've built from scratch. It used to be back in the day an Excel spreadsheet that's now evolved into this interactive tool. And Sean's been very helpful in helping us to kind of break out the legal. So it's got legal stuff in there, but it's also got some HR best practice. And it takes about 15 minutes to do. And it's very interactive. It gives you a really quick snapshot on what's good, what's bad, but then it also creates a HR plan for you and tells you why. So if something's missing, you go, okay, we're going to build a plan, and our developer in the background's done an amazing job to basically automate that stage or those processes. So I'd really encourage you to jump on that. And I think Millie's going to drop that in the chat. Feel free to jump on there. And again, it's not, you don't have to, you can actually toggle off whether you want us to contact you or not. So we don't sort of stalk you with marketing. It's completely optional. You can say, I want to do this independently, and that's fine. And there's no pressure from us. And that was it in terms of our slides. I know we've still got some time for questions. Paul, are there any other questions people had?
Yeah, let's see if we can run through them as quickly as possible. So we've got one here where it says, what happens in a situation where you have to make redundancies, but your business doesn't have the funds to process the physical redundancy payment? Prolonging the employment will only place further financial stress on the business. How and what options are available to businesses who need to reduce to save business, and how is this best managed?
Yeah.
You really need to talk to an insolvency practitioner at that point, because you're not able to pay your debts when as they fall due. So that's I'd probably talk to your accountant to start with and get help with that area of things.
Absolutely. You got bigger issues than us. And yeah, working with us, I think. Yeah, I agree with Sean's comment there.
Great. Another one here. Some organizations go through restructure and they ask employees who are likely to be redundant to apply for the role, even if they're able to do the role. Where do you stand on that position?
Sorry, can you say that again? Sorry.
Yeah. Some organizations go through restructure and they ask employees who are likely to be redundant to apply for the role, even if they're able to do the role. Where would you stand on that position?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I agree. They can apply. So there's a vacancy. We encourage them to apply for that role and then we can consider that person. Are they a good fit for that role? But again, they might not be. The example I gave before could be a salesperson applying for an account's role. It doesn't make sense. So it's got to be a rational business decision of why this person would be a good fit. And then you'd go back to the position description. Do they fit the skills and qualifications of that role? Yes, then we can consider it. But if they don't, we're kind of squeezing, someone into a box that doesn't fit. It just doesn't make sense. What would you add anything to that, Sean?
No, I think that's about right. As long as you're not making the person apply for their own role, because that
No.
gets a bit tricky because you've sort of already made a decision to make their role redundant, if that's the case.
Yeah.
But if they're being made redundant and then you're looking at redeployment and you sort of asking them to apply for a particular role, keeping in mind that you do have to be proactive about redeployment as well.
Yeah. You'd put that forward to them and say there's an opportunity here, but it would have to be logical. And that's where it can get quite complex around people wanting, if they're not confident in finding a role in another organization, they kind of grappling at straws to find a role within the organization that's not quite logical. And then you've got to be careful about putting someone into a role that's more of an emotional decision than an actual business decision. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yep.
These are all great questions, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. So another one here. So in some cases, this person has had employees struggle more during consultation due to the uncertainty than if the decision had just been communicated. Where cases require consultation, what tips do you have besides EAP to help support employees during that uncertainty?
That is a brilliant question, because the consultation obligations are a Fair Work legislated requirement, but sometimes there's decisions that it's going to be hard to change the outcome, and you feel like sometimes you're going through a process, don't you? That you go like they've got to come up with something amazing to change the outcome of this, and it does feel like sometimes you're kind of stepping through a process. That is it beneficial or is it negative for the human? That's the delicate balance, I guess, that we navigate in the conversations. And one of the things I do is ask people questions in the process to say, things like, is this something you're likely to accept? If somebody says, yeah, look, get me out of here, you go, no problems. Let's send me an email. And I know whether I'm breaking employment law here, Sean, but I would say if someone's saying, yep, look, I actually want to just take the redundancy, just let's not muck around. I would say, look, great. If that's your decision, send me an email to that effect. And then we can then take that on board. And then that just speeds up the whole process, particularly if they've been through the process before, they know where it's going, or they might say, yippee, I'm being made redundant. This is what I want. I'm excited by a redundancy, and you have every reaction you can imagine through these. Sometimes the best news they've ever heard. And they just say, yeah, show me the money, tell me the process. How do I do this? Get this done straight away. And I'd say, send me an email and we'll make this happen as soon as possible.
Yeah, it's all about following the truth, isn't it? I mean, yeah.
And what about you, Sean, in terms of, I hope I'm not breaking employment law. That's what I've done.
No, I mean, I agree. Like the consultation obligations can sometimes create more stress for someone because it elongates the process and someone has to sit in uncertainty for a long time. So I agree with your approach. Like I think you've got to be mindful of each person and the effect it's having on them, and take whatever steps you can to try to ameliorate that risk, that stress for people. And sometimes that does mean a faster process, or asking them, if they're okay, just to come bring it to a completion sooner. Whereas then some people do want to go through a proper process because they feel they want to have input into the decision.
I do. And and different lawyers will have different perspectives. Some lawyers will say you need to have the meeting 1 week, give them a week to consider it, and then come back the following week. So you're doing over 3 or 4 weeks of consultation, which creates its own risks, in my view. So it's finding the balance between being perfect from a ticking the boxes process versus what is respectful, and which is why we're running this this session on being respectful around it. Just being mindful of time. Were there any other burning questions people had? We're happy to stick back at the end as well. we might wrap it up there because we've just jumped over time. But
Yeah.
we'd love to hear if people want to drop some thoughts into what would be a great subject for the next Lunch and Learn. We've done probationary reviews, probationary periods. We've done redundancies. We keep adding adverse action. Sean and I and Celine would like to do one on adverse action, but we feel like
Yeah.
people.
Let us know if you would like that.
Yeah, we feel like it's so dry, but we'll keep talking about it even if people don't ask. And but we'd love to know what topic you'd love to tackle next. We haven't got a firm agenda. We're kind of going with the flow a bit based on what people's needs are. But yeah, put your thoughts out, and we're happy to follow what the group's suggesting in terms of what would be a useful topic. And we're planning to run these like every 3 to 4 weeks, and again make them as interactive as possible. Paul is recording them, so he's recording these sessions. So, and if you don't make them, you can look them, and he's uploading them to YouTube. So we do then send them out as well, so you can look at them afterwards. But yeah, I reckon we wrap it up because we could just keep talking, and I'm sure there's lots of questions. It is quite a complex topic, but we'll hang back and chat further. But I really love to thank everybody for their input. It makes it really interesting for us to have lots of really, really great questions. And they were amazing questions, by the way, weren't they? They were some of the, they were just fantastic.
Very good questions.
But yeah, we're very welcome to stick back and chat further. But in terms of this Lunch and Learn, we'll call it closed. But again, feel free. Sean, is there anything we've missed? Any final thoughts, comments?
No, I think it's all good. I just want to say thanks to everyone for joining us, and yeah, really good questions. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Buddy.